Costa-Gavras' Z exploded onto screens in 1969 as a political thriller that felt ripped from tomorrow's headlines. But beneath the pulse-pounding investigation and Oscar glory lies a layer of intentional craft most viewers never catch. Choices that transformed a courtroom procedural into a weapon of resistance. What if the film's most subversive act wasn't what it showed, but how it made you see? What if the documentary Feel You Remember was actually a carefully constructed illusion, and the thriller mechanics hit a quieter devastation? Let's pull back the curtain on the performance rhythms, visual codes, and structural traps that turned a Greek tragedy into a universal call to witness. This is the detail that changes how you see Z, the one most fans never figured out: the illusion of neutrality. Here's what Z pretends to be: a detached, almost clinical reconstruction of a political assassination and the investigation that followed. The camera moves like a journalist's eye. The actors deliver lines with the flatness of court testimony. The editing snaps from scene to scene with bureaucratic efficiency, meant to feel like you're watching evidence unfold, not a story being told. But that neutrality is the film's greatest sleight of hand. Costa-Gavras and screenwriter Jorge Semprún built Z as a Trojan horse, a thriller that doesn't argue or speechify, but instead traps you inside the machinery of state violence until you understand it from the inside. Though what most fans miss thesis lives here. Z is engineered to feel like documentation while actually functioning as radicalization through form. Every objective choice, the handheld urgency, the elliptical editing, the refusal to pause for emotional release, is a calculated move to make you complicit, exhausted, and finally furious. The film's four pillars reveal themselves slowly. First, the performance strategy. Actors instructed to strip away theatrical emotion and play bureaucratic banality as horror. Second, the visual grammar. How Costa-Gavras used choreography and framing to turn crowds into organisms and individuals into statistics. Third, the structural trap. A thriller that gives you the satisfaction of solved mysteries while denying you any hope of justice. And fourth, the sound design secret. How silence and diegetic noise replaced score to make terror feel procedural, inevitable, like paperwork. Most retrospectives focus on Z's political courage or its influence on the conspiracy thriller genre. The deeper story is about technique as ideology. How the film's formal choices don't just tell you fascism is evil, but make you experience the suffocation of living under it. And here's the part that changes everything. Costa-Gavras didn't want you to leave the theater angry at the villains. He wanted you angry at the system that makes such villains not just possible, but efficient. The film is an instruction manual for recognizing the aesthetics of authoritarianism, and it's hidden in plain sight. 2. Context. No One Remembers Z premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1969. 5 months after the April 1967 Greek military coup, it depicts through allegory, and mere months after the real-world Paris uprisings of May 1968. The political air was combustible. Audiences weren't just watching a thriller, they were watching a mirror held up to regimes from Athens to Prague to Santiago. Anywhere the machinery of state power had recently crushed democratic movements. But the production context matters just as much. Costa-Gavras shot the film in Algeria because filming in Greece under the junta was impossible. The military dictatorship had banned Vasilis Vasilikos' source novel the moment it was published. The cast and crew worked with the knowledge that what they were making was, legally speaking, an act of sedition against a sitting government. Algeria provided not just locations, but a kind of kinship. This was a nation that understood anti-colonial resistance, that knew the grammar of state violence intimately. The studio climate was equally vital. Cinema verite techniques had primed audiences to read shaky cameras and natural light as truth. The French New Wave had normalized jump cuts and elliptical storytelling. Political cinema had found a commercial lane through films like The Battle of Algiers, 1966, which proved that documentary-style reconstruction could be both artistically rigorous and box office viable. Costa-Gavras walked through a door those films had opened, but he brought a new weapon. the engine of a Hollywood thriller grafted onto the body of an exposé. 1969, American and European audiences were fluent in both activist documentaries and genre filmmaking, but no one had yet fused them with this level of formal discipline. The context created the conditions, but the execution, now that's where most fans miss the intentionality. The film wasn't assembled in the editing room as much as it was engineered in pre-production. The answer became the film's hidden architecture. Third, the persona paradox. Yves Montand was a star, sophisticated, charismatic, the kind of screen presence that commands a room. His deputy, the peace activist whose assassination sparks the investigation, appears for maybe 15 minutes of screen time. And in those 15 minutes, Montand does something radical. He drains away his charisma. He plays the deputy as tired, earnest, almost bureaucratically committed to nonviolence. There's no martyrdom complex, no fiery speeches, just a man trying to organize a peaceful rally while fascist thugs circle. Costa-Gavras instructed Montand to avoid heroism. The deputy couldn't be a larger-than-life figure because that would make his death feel exceptional, tragic in the classical sense. One great man struck down. Instead, his ordinariness is the point, dispensable to the regime precisely because he's effective, but not mythic. His death should feel senseless and small, a bureaucratic erasure, because that's how authoritarianism works. It doesn't battle heroes, it processes obstacles. The same strategy runs through Jean-Louis Trintignant's performance as the examining magistrate. Trintignant was known for intensity, for smoldering presence. Here, he's almost effectless, a technocrat who speaks in questions, who processes evidence with the dry efficiency of an accountant. His investigation isn't driven by righteous fury, but by procedural rigor. He doesn't give speeches about justice. He files papers. And that's why his ultimate defeat lands with such devastation. The system doesn't break him emotionally. It simply overrules him administratively. The persona paradox cuts deeper when you realize both actors were politically active in real life. Montand had been a communist, had performed for strikers and activists. Trintignant navigated French cinema's political factions carefully. They brought lived understanding of how the left actually organizes, not through cinematic grandstanding, but through tedious meetings, permit applications, and coalition building. Their choice to play exhaustion rather than passion was itself a political statement. Resistance under authoritarianism is exhausting, procedural, often thankless work. Most fans walk away remembering the thriller, beats, the chase, the testimonies, the revelation. What they don't consciously register is how the film made them feel powerless by design, so the final act's litany of banned items would hit like a fist. The decision that changed everything. The original plan was to shoot Z more like a traditional courtroom drama. Longer takes, more reaction shots, a score that would guide emotional responses. Composer Mikis Theodorakis had written music, lush and mournful, that would have made the film feel like a eulogy for democracy. Costa-Gavras scrapped almost all of it. The decision came during pre-production after the director watched Gillo Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers again. He realized something crucial. A score tells you how to feel. It provides catharsis. And catharsis is the enemy of the film Z needed to be. Instead, the soundscape would be almost entirely diegetic. Crowd noise, car engines, footsteps, the clatter of typewriters, the rustling of documents. Theodorakis' music would appear only twice, once as source music at a rally, where it makes narrative sense, and once in the final moments, where its sudden arrival after 2 hours of silence would feel like a gasp, a cry the film had been holding in. This meant re-choreographing dozens of scenes. Without a score to smooth transitions or underscore tension, every cut had to generate its own momentum. The editing rhythm became percussive, short scenes that slam into each other, creating a sense of accelerating inevitability. Conversations happen in mid-sentence. We arrive late and leave early. The film denies you the comfort of establishing shots or emotional punctuation. The ripple effects were enormous. Actors had to recalibrate performances without the cushion of music to carry sentiment. The sound design team, led by Antoine Bonfanti, became co-authors of the film's emotional architecture. They layered ambient noise so that even quiet scenes buzz with low-level menace. Distant traffic, murmured conversations, the hum of institutions churning on. Final sound mix was completed just 3 weeks before Cannes, with Costa-Gavras and Bonfanti working around the clock to balance clarity with chaos. And here's what that decision unlocked. Without a score to signal this is the emotional climax, every moment carries equal weight. A man getting clubbed in an alley has the same sonic texture as a bureaucrat signing a form. Equivalence is the film's secret weapon. It makes violence feel administrative, which is exactly how state violence functions. The clubs and the paperwork aren't separate acts. They're the same act, just different phases of the same machinery. Most fans remember Z as tense and propulsive, but they don't realize the tension comes from sonic deprivation, from the absence of the very thing, a score, they've been conditioned to expect. The film makes you lean forward because it refuses to comfort you. And once you notice this voice, you can't unsee it. Onset reality. The Algerian locations gave Costa-Gavras freedom from censorship, but presented their own challenges. The production shot during the summer of 1968 in searing heat that shows up in the actors' faces. The sweat isn't makeup. It's real. Scenes required hundreds of local extras, many of whom brought their own recent memories of French colonial violence. The line between performance and lived experience blurred constantly. Tignant later described the shoot as an endurance test disguised as filmmaking. Scenes in the courthouse and police headquarters were shot in actual government buildings, with the Algerian government's blessing, but also its watchful eye. The crew worked under the knowledge that they were guests in a nation still processing its own trauma, making a film about another nation's trauma. The responsibility sat heavy. The decision to shoot chronologically whenever possible, rare for productions even then, meant the actors experienced the investigation's grinding momentum in real time. By the time they filmed the late-stage interrogations, Trintignant and the ensemble genuinely looked exhausted. There's a scene where the magistrate reviews files late at night, and Trintignant's 1,000-yard stare isn't acting. It's the culmination of weeks immersed in procedural repetition. Budget constraints shaped the aesthetic in ways that ended up serving the film's purpose. Unable to afford elaborate tracking shots or crane work, cinematographer Raoul Coutard, who'd shot Breathless and much of the French New Wave, the camera handheld or locked on a tripod, toggling between urgent mobility and bureaucratic stillness. What might have looked cheap became a visual grammar. The camera chases action through streets, then goes static and observational in offices, mimicking how power moves, chaotic in public, coldly controlled in private. The production also grappled with legal fears. Even though they were shooting in Algeria, the Greek junta had a long reach, and several cast members had families still in Greece. Montand, a high-profile target for right-wing groups, received threats. Security on set was constant, but invisible, another layer of tension that bled into the work. The film's paranoia wasn't manufactured. It was the air everyone breathed. Costa-Gavras shot 220,000 feet of film over 9 weeks, an unusually high shooting ratio that reflected his documentary-inspired approach of capturing spontaneous moments and crowd chaos. The physical toll matters because it's legible in the final product. These aren't actors pretending to be worn down. They are worn down. Film's refusal to provide emotional release mirrors the crew's experience of making it, a relentless grind toward a conclusion everyone knew was coming but hoped somehow wouldn't. That texture, that bone-deep weariness, is what separates Z from slicker political thriller. It feels lived in because it was. 6. What most fans miss. There's a moment midway through Z that most viewers register but don't consciously decode. The magistrate is interviewing a witness, a drunk who saw the attack but whose testimony is unreliable, contaminated by alcohol and fear. The camera frames the drunk in a medium close-up but slightly off-center. Behind him, barely in focus, a police officer stands by the door. The officer never moves, never speaks. He's just there. That's the film in miniature. The threat isn't foregrounded. It's ambient. The officer's presence renders the testimony meaningless before a word is spoken, because both the witness and the magistrate understand the real audience for this conversation. The state. The witness isn't confessing. He's negotiating his own survival, and the film doesn't cut to the officer. For emphasis, doesn't underline the point with music or a reaction shot. It trusts you to feel the suffocation of that framing. Here's another. Watch the crowd scenes during the rally in the film's opening act. Costa-Gavras choreographed them to move like a single organism, not in perfect unison, which would look staged, but with overlapping waves of momentum. When the fascist thugs arrive, the crowd doesn't scatter in random panic. Instead, people compress inward, creating a tighter mass, which makes individuals harder to pick off, but also creates crush points. It's exactly how real crowds behave under threat, seeking safety in density. Most filmmakers would stage the chaos as explosive dispersion. Costa-Gavras stages it as terrified consolidation. The third micro-detail lives in the film's use of vehicles. Cars and trucks aren't just transportation, they're instruments of power. The deputy is struck by a van. The thugs arrive in coordinated vehicles. The police use cars to control space, blocking roads and corridors. Meanwhile, the investigators walk, take buses, squeeze into cramped offices. The film's transportation hierarchy is a class analysis. Who commands speed and metal commands the narrative. By the end, when the magistrate's findings are delivered via car to an office, reversal is complete. The vehicle system has absorbed even the tools of accountability. Notice, too, the film's relationship with doors. Characters are constantly entering and exiting rooms, but the camera rarely shows both sides of a threshold. We're either inside looking out or outside looking in. This creates a spatial paranoia. You're never sure who's on the other side, who's listening, who's about to enter. It mimics the experience of surveillance states, where every boundary is permeable to power, but opaque to citizens. The magistrate's office should feel like a sanctuary of law, but doors keep opening unannounced, reminding us that privacy is a privilege the state grants and revokes at will. The film's costume designer dressed the thugs in almost identical dark jackets and the investigators in slightly rumpled suits, a visual shorthand repeated in political thrillers for decades after, most famously in films like All the President's Men and The Lives of Others. The final detail most fans miss is in the ending's structure. After the magistrate's report is buried, the film doesn't fade to black or cut to a coda. Instead, it presents a title card listing everything the new regime has banned. Peace movements, strikes, long hair. It's a litany that starts almost absurdly, miniskirts, but builds to a suffocating comprehensiveness. And the stroke of genius is this: the conflict. Central tension wasn't between Costa-Gavras and a studio. It was between the film's documentary aspirations and its thriller mechanics. Could Z deliver the satisfactions of a mystery, clues, reveals, escalating stakes, while refusing the comforts of heroism and redemption? Could it be entertaining without being exploitative? Production navigated this tightrope daily. Prune's screenplay was rigorously researched, drawn from Vasilikos's novel, which itself was based on the real 1963 assassination of Greek politician Grigoris Lambrakis. But research alone doesn't create momentum. The writers faced a challenge. Everyone watching would know how this ended. Greece was under a dictatorship. The junta had won. So the investigation's success couldn't be the film's emotional payoff. Instead, the payoff had to be clarity. The satisfaction of understanding exactly how the system crushed justice down to the procedural details. This meant the film had to be two things simultaneously: a thriller that rewards attention with revelations, and a tragedy that denies catharsis. Every time the magistrate uncovers evidence, the film gives you the dopamine hit of progress. And every time that evidence is ignored or suppressed, the film reminds you that progress is illusory when power is corrupt. This wasn't a bug. It was the design. Costa-Gavras faced pushback from advisors who worried the film was too cold, too procedural to connect emotionally. Why not give audiences more time with the deputy before his death? Why not let the Yabais magistrate have a personal stake, a family threatened by his investigation? These would have been conventional thriller choices, deepening investment through personal jeopardy. The director refused. Personal stakes would make this a story about individuals. The film needed to be about systems. The international distribution posed another conflict. American distributors initially wanted to re-edit for U.S. audiences, adding explanatory title cards about Greek politics, maybe trimming the ending's banned list for length. Costa-Gavras held firm. The film's power came from trusting audiences to do the work, to connect dots without being spoon-fed. The discomfort of not fully understanding every political reference was part of the experience. It mimicked the fog of living under authoritarianism, where information is partial and truth is fragmented. Z won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film in 1970 and was also nominated for Best Picture, one of the first foreign films to receive that dual recognition, forcing the American film industry to grapple with politically radical work on its own terms. Critics, too, were divided along predictable lines. Left-leaning reviewers celebrated the film's political courage and formal innovation. Conservative critics dismissed it as propaganda, arguing that its stacked deck, virtuous leftists versus thuggish fascists, was simplistic. That criticism missed the film's actual architecture. The villains aren't cartoonish strongmen. They're bureaucrats, lawyers, officers who speak in euphemisms and follow procedures. The film's true antagonist is the system's ability to absorb and neutralize reform through its own mechanisms. Committees, reports, jurisdictional ambiguities. That's not simplistic, it's surgical. The conflict between entertainment and activism, between accessibility and rigor, never fully resolved. Z exists in the tension, refusing to choose. It's what makes the film so durable and so frustrating. It won't let you off the hook with either mindless thrills or didactic lecturing. It demands you stay alert, complicit, and ultimately implicated in the question it never stops asking. When you witness injustice being processed as paperwork, what do you do next? The irony. The film ends with the magistrate's investigation successfully identifying the conspirators, tracing the assassination back to government and military figures. Justice, briefly, seems possible. Then, abruptly, a military coup dissolves the government, the findings are buried, and the magistrate himself is removed from office. The investigation succeeds and fails in the same breath. That's the film's central irony. The system allows you to prove its guilt, then reminds you that proof without power is just paper. But the deeper irony lives in the film's reception. Z became an international sensation, winning awards, selling tickets, influencing filmmakers across continents. It was celebrated as a masterpiece of political cinema, and all the while, the Greek junta it depicted remained in power. The film couldn't overthrow the regime it portrayed. The dictatorship lasted until 1974, 5 years after Z premiered. During those years, the film was banned in Greece. Citizens couldn't see it without risking arrest. The very people whose story it told couldn't witness their own depiction. When the junta finally collapsed and democracy returned, Z screened in Athens for the first time. Audiences who'd lived through the events wept not just at the film's content, but at the displacement, seeing their trauma reflected back to them years later, mediated through Algerian locations and French actors. Catharsis came late, and it came knowing that the film, for all its international acclaim, hadn't saved them. They'd saved themselves through resistance the film never depicted because it happened after Costa-Gavras' cameras stopped rolling. There's also irony in how Z became a template. Dozens of political thrillers followed its formula. All the President's Men, Missing, The Parallax View. Films that use procedural investigation to expose institutional corruption. The genre became so common that paranoid thriller emerged as a category. What was radical in 1969 became conventional by 1975. The film's aesthetic of resistance was absorbed, defanged, turned into a style rather than a stance. You can now make a movie that looks like Z without making one that cuts like it. The ultimate irony might be this. Z's most famous line, "He's very much alive," the crowd's chant for the deputy that gives the film its title, Z being a Greek homophone for he lives, was co-opted by everyone. Leftist movements chanted it at rallies. Right-wing groups also appropriated it, applying the martyr formula to their own fallen figures. The film's language of resistance became politically untethered, available to anyone claiming martyrdom. Costa-Gavras created a symbol that escaped his control, which is perhaps the definition of cultural victory and loss simultaneously. Even the awards became ironic. The Academy, not exactly a bastion of radical leftism, gave Z its highest honors. Hollywood celebrated a film about how institutions crush dissent. By institutionalizing the film itself, making it safe, canonical, a historical artifact, rather than a living warning. The film that showed how systems absorb threats was absorbed by the very system of prestige cinema it implicitly critiqued. And yet, Z endures, still teaches, still radicalizes new viewers who stumble across it. The irony is that the film predicted its own fate. It proved the system's guilt, presented the evidence, and then watched as the system simply shrugged and continued. But the proof remained. The document survived. And sometimes that's all resistance can hope for, to last long enough for the next generation to find it and understand. The breakthrough. Numbers came fast. Z opened in Paris in February 1969 and sold over 1 million tickets within weeks, staggering for a political thriller in a foreign language. By the time it reached American theaters that December, word of mouth had built anticipation to a fever pitch. Critics at the New York Times and Le Monde called it essential viewing, not just for its politics, but for its craft. Pauline Kael, rarely effusive, praised its cold fury and surgical precision. But the real breakthrough wasn't box office. It was permission. Z proved that politically radical films could be both artistically rigorous and commercially viable without compromise. Studios had assumed audiences needed watered-down politics wrapped in star power and sentimentality. Costa-Gavras demonstrated the opposite. Treat audiences as intelligent, refuse to comfort them, trust them to handle complexity, and they'll respond with intensity. The film's influence on craft was immediate and tangible. Cinematographers studied Coutard's handheld work, the way he kept the camera low in crowd scenes to simulate participant perspective. Editors analyzed the rhythmic brutality of Z's cuts, how scenes end mid-gesture to create propulsion. Sound designers realized they could withhold music without losing audiences, that ambient noise could generate more tension than orchestral swells. Z also shifted representation in political cinema. The deputy wasn't an American everyman transposed into European politics. He was Greek, specific, culturally located. The film didn't translate the politics into universal abstractions. It trusted non-Greek audiences to do the work of understanding. This opened a door for films like State of Siege and Missing, political thrillers set in Chile, Uruguay, and other non-universal settings that nonetheless found global audiences. The catchphrase factor can't be ignored either. He Lives became a rallying cry at protests across Europe and Latin America in the 70s and 80s. Activists saw themselves in the film's crowds, in the deputy's exhausted idealism, in the magistrate's feudal rigor. He gave the left a visual vocabulary, not just slogans but shot compositions, ways of filming state violence that became templates for documentary and fiction alike. By 1975, Z had been seen by an estimated 100 million people worldwide, making it one of the most watched political films in history, a remarkable figure for a work that never softened its edges or courted mainstream appeal. Perhaps the most unexpected breakthrough was in academia. Film schools dissected Z frame by frame, turning it into a teaching text. It appeared on syllabi, not just in cinema studies, but in political science and journalism courses. Students learn to spot propaganda by studying a film that refuses propaganda's techniques. The movie became part of the toolkit for understanding how images convey ideology, not through what they say, but through how they structure your looking. And here's the detail most fans miss. The breakthrough wasn't instant cultural dominance. Z didn't spawn immediate imitators or a genre wave. Instead, it seeped slowly into filmmaking's collective unconscious, shaping what directors thought was possible. When Alan Pakula shot All the President's Men 7 years later, he wasn't copying Z beat for beat. He'd simply internalized the lesson that procedural rigor could be cinematic, that withholding catharsis could be more powerful than granting it. Film didn't shout, it endured. And in enduring, it changed the landscape not by force, but by example. Every handheld shot in a protest scene, every thriller that ends with institutional victory, every film that trusts silence over score, they're all in conversation with Z, whether the filmmakers know it or not. Ripple effects. Costa-Gavras went on to make a career of political thrillers, State of Siege, Missing Music Box, each dissecting a different flavor of institutional violence, but none quite recaptured Z's lightning in a bottle fusion of fury and form. He became the godfather of the paranoid political thriller, a genre that flowered in the 70s and still pulses through everything from The Bourne Identity to Spotlight. For the actors, Z was a pivot point. Trintignant became the face of European art cinema's political turn, appearing in films like The Conformist that explored fascism's psychology. Montan's late career choices leaned harder into politically engaged work, his star power now a tool for drawing audiences to uncomfortable subjects. The ensemble cast, many of whom were Greek exiles, found that Z had made their personal histories bankable. Suddenly, European cinema wanted stories about dictatorship, displacement, resistance. The genre itself mutated under Z's influence. The conspiracy thriller became a staple of 1970s American cinema, films that depicted institutions, government, corporations, media, as labyrinths designed to trap and neutralize threats. The parallax view, 3 Days of the Condor, The Conversation, they all owe DNA to Z's formula of procedural investigation, meeting systemic futility. The difference is that many American versions added a glimmer of redemption, a whistleblower who escapes, or a journalist who publishes. Z's refusal to grant that comfort remains its sharpest edge. In Latin America, Z became a template for politically engaged filmmakers working under military regimes. Directors in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil studied how Costa-Gavras navigated allegory and directness, how he made a film about Greece that was actually about everywhere. When those filmmakers needed to depict their own nation's traumas without triggering censors, they borrowed Z's techniques, the procedural framing, the withholding of score, the trust in audiences to decode. Film also influenced documentary practices. Filmmakers like Marcel Ophuls and Errol Morris took note of how Z blurred fiction and fact, how it used thriller mechanics to heighten real-world stakes rather than diminish them. The idea that you could take documented events and structure them with cinematic rigor, not as reenactment, but as interpretation, became a cornerstone of new documentary practices in the 70s and 80s. Even advertising and music videos borrowed from Z's visual language. The handheld urgency, the avoidance of obvious beauty, the privileging of texture over gloss, these became signifiers of authenticity and rawness in visual media. By the 90s, you could watch a car commercial shot with the same restless energy Costa-Gavras used to film state violence. The technique severed from its original purpose, a style without substance. The ripple effects extend to how we talk about political cinema today. When people describe a film as important or urgent or necessary, they're often invoking Zhou's model. Cinema that doesn't just depict politics, but enacts a political stance through form. The problem is that label gets slapped on anything that gestures at social issues, even films that lack Z's discipline. The genre Z pioneered got so flooded with imitators that the original's precision is sometimes forgotten. Audiences still use Z's framing without knowing the source. When protesters film police violence on cell phones, the composition, low angle, handheld, no score, just ambient chaos, echoes Costa-Gavras' choices. The visual grammar of resistance was shaped in part by this film. People who've never heard of Z are speaking its language every time they document power's abuses in real time, trusting the rawness to convey truth. And the quote, "He lives," still appears on banners and graffiti worldwide, often for causes unconnected to Greek politics or even leftism. Became a universal assertion of martyrdom's refusal. the idea that killing the person doesn't kill the idea. Whether that's a testament to Z's enduring power or a sign of its dilution depends on your optimism. Maybe both. Why it endures. Reframe. Strip away the awards and the influence and the historical context, and Z endures because it does something most political films won't. It refuses to lie to you about how power works. It doesn't promise that truth will set you free, that one brave individual can topple a system, that justice is inevitable if you just work hard enough. Instead, it shows you the machinery, how fascism isn't a dramatic rupture, but a procedural tightening, how violence gets laundered through paperwork, how the system absorbs resistance by letting you win battles while it wins the war. And here's why that matters now. Why the film doesn't feel like a period piece. We're still living in Z's world. The specific regime changed, but the mechanisms didn't. Surveillance, selective enforcement, the bureaucratization of cruelty, the way institutions protect themselves while claiming to serve justice. Costa-Gavras mapped that terrain with such precision that the map still works 50-plus years later. The film endures because it's not about Greece in 1963. It's about how authority functions when it stops pretending to care about accountability. But there's also something humane in the film's bleakness. The magistrate loses, but he doesn't surrender. He completes his report knowing it will be buried because completing it is the act that matters. He dies, but his movement doesn't. The film's final list of banned items, books, music, ideas, is an admission of power's ultimate weakness. It fears thought. Ban Tolstoy because he's irrelevant. You ban him because his relevance threatens you. He also endures because it treats its audiences with respect. It doesn't pander, doesn't simplify, doesn't offer false hope. It trusts you to sit with discomfort, to do the work of interpretation, to leave the theater angry and activated rather than satisfied and passive. That's a rare gift in cinema then. And now, a film that believes you can handle the truth, even when the truth is that the system is designed to outlast your outrage. The film's reframe is this. What most fans thought they were watching, a historical thriller about a specific assassination, is actually a training manual in recognizing authoritarianism's aesthetics. The procedural flatness, the bureaucratic euphemisms, the way violence gets framed as law and order, the silencing through administrative channels rather than overt force. Z teaches you to spot these patterns. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. That's why the film still feels urgent. The tactics haven't changed, only the nations deploying them have multiplied. Also the matter of form as resistance. Z proves that you don't need to make aesthetically beautiful films about beautiful resistance. You can make a film that mirrors the grinding, exhausting, often futile work of actual resistance, unsexy, procedural, accumulative, and still create something that resonates across decades. The film's aesthetic austerity is itself a political stance. It refuses to beautify struggle, to make suffering pornographic, to turn martyrdom into spectacle. And maybe that's the deepest reason Z endures. It shows us that clarity is possible even in defeat. The magistrate's report exists. The deputies' movement was real. The evidence was gathered, the conspirators named. Power buried it, but the act of documentation mattered. The film is the magistrate's report writ large, a record that says, "This happened, we saw it, you cannot claim it didn't." In a world increasingly hostile to truth as a concept, that insistence on evidence, on procedural integrity, on naming names even when you know it won't change the outcome, that feels radical again. Z doesn't offer hope that resistance will win. It offers something harder and more durable, proof that resistance happened, that some people chose clarity over complicity, that the record can survive even when the people who made it don't. That's not a comfortable truth. But it's a true one, and the film never stops asking, now that you know, now that you've seen the machinery, what will you do? Will you look away? Will you file it as history? Or will you recognize the patterns in your own moment and act accordingly? That question is why Z endures, not because it answers anything, but because it refuses to let you stop asking. The choice is yours. So here's what you do next. You watch Z again, But this time you watch for the silences, the places where a score should swell but doesn't, the rooms where doors open without warning, the vehicles that divide crowds, the officer standing motionless in the background while a witness speaks. You watch for the exhaustion in Trintignant's eyes and the deliberate absence of heroism in Montaigne's deputy. Notice how the film traps you in bureaucratic rhythms until you feel the suffocation in your chest. And then you ask yourself, where am I seeing this now? What contemporary footage uses this visual? Language? Which institutions in my own moment are processing violence as paperwork, are framing cruelty as procedure, are asking me to trust that justice is inevitable when all evidence suggests otherwise? He didn't die with the Greek junta. It didn't become irrelevant when the credits rolled or when it won its awards. It's still here, still teaching, still asking you to stay awake. The choice it presents isn't political in the narrow sense, left versus right, this party versus that. The choice is about whether you'll train yourself to recognize power's aesthetics, to see past the procedural language to the violence it conceals. Most fans never figured out that Z is a mirror. They thought it was showing them Greece. It was showing them everything, everywhere, all the mechanisms that turn justice into spectacle and resistance into paperwork. Now you know. Now you see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Watch it again with fresh eyes. Then tell me, what did you miss the first time? What are you missing right now?